All right, let's get into how to do some adjustment layers and masks to do selective editing on an image. I'm going to open this image from Lightroom. I've already done some basic adjustments to it in Lightroom. I won't go over that again, but we're just going to go from Lightroom into Photoshop. And as usual, I'm going to go to the Photo menu. As soon as the wheel stops spinning here, I'm going to go to the Photo menu, Edit in, and Open as Smart Object in Photoshop, the way we always should. As I'm waiting for this to open, let me remind you that you should always go to your Lightroom preferences and make sure that you are opening images in the Adobe RGB 1998 workspace. That's a preset, that's a tab I should say, in your preferences under External Editing tab. You can set those. And now we have the image open in Photoshop. I will point out, as always, that because I've opened it as a smart object, in my layers palette I have this thumbnail with the smart object icon, and I can always double click on that icon to open the image into Adobe Camera Raw if I want to do any global adjustments to my image. But in this case, I want to do selective adjustments, and I'm going to use masks and adjustment layers to do things like increase the contrast of the foreground, to increase the contrast of the sky, etc. So I'm going to show you a few different ways to do this. What I generally like to do is select an area first using either the quick mask mode or the quick selection tool, and then create an adjustment layer to change how that particular region of my picture looks. So let's talk about the quick mask mode. At the bottom of your layers palette, almost at the very bottom, there's this little square with a dotted circle in the middle of it. That tool is your quick mask mode. And before I get into using it, the first time I use it, I always double click it to open up this options. Now by default, usually this says color indicates masked areas. I like to work with the color indicating the selected areas, or what will become the selected areas. I will point out also that if you don't like red as the overlay color, if you want the red to be more or less opaque, you can change those options here too. I'm going to click OK. I want to look back at this tool and make sure that it is still darkened in. That tells me it's active. It doesn't look darkened in. Click it once again to make sure that it's active. Then I'll also point out while I'm here that we have our foreground and background color. If you click on the little mini version, it will default back to black and white. If you want to swap those colors back and forth, you can click on this little double arrow. You can also tap the X key. Tap, tap, tap on the X key switches it. So I'm going to paint with black. And what black will look like, this sounds really odd, but black will look red. We will get a red overlay, and that red overlay indicates what will become a selection. And so I'm going to work with a brush, about that big, and I'm going to work with kind of a medium hardness on my brush. I never brush with 100% hardness, but medium hardness in this case. And I'm going to turn my opacity, if it was down low because I was doing a dodge and burn layer, I'm going to turn my opacity and flow back up to 100%. I want my blending mode for this brush to be in normal. Should be by default, but it's always good to check that. You can paint this with lower opacity and lower flow for various reasons, but for right now we're going to keep it simple. And you'll see that as I click and drag over my image, I'm seeing a red overlay, even though I'm painting with black technically as my foreground color. What it shows me is a red overlay, and that red overlay is what will become a selection. One thing that's nice about the quick mask mode is I'm working with a brush, so I can vary the hardness, I can vary the opacity if I need to. I don't have to have an exact hard-edged selection. And that makes it really simple for this. I'm just going to have this kind of have a little bit of a soft edge right where this foreground grass meets that background plowed cornfield or whatever. Once I have painted something in red, now I'm going to exit the quick mask mode by clicking on this icon a second time, and you'll see that now that selection is marked by our marching ants outline. When I have, when I have that marching ants outline, that is now a selection. If I wanted to, I could save that selection. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to now go to my Create New Adjustment Layer button down at the bottom of the Layers palette, and you'll see this long list of different adjustments that I can make. I'm going to use curves. Curves is so good for so many things, tonal range and color. I'm going to use it for tonal range in this case. And there we go, there's our curve. And because I'm going to use it for tonal range, meaning lightness, darkness, contrast adjustments, not wanting to affect the color, I'm immediately going to switch the blending mode of this layer from normal to luminosity. You can't see it's just below that frame, but luminosity is the very bottom option. Maybe if I shrink this in a second, you can see it. So if I pop open this button, I go to the very bottom. Oh, it's still not going to quite, nope, that's not where it is. Right here, blending mode. That's still not going to show you, but luminosity is the very bottom option. You want to change that blending mode from normal to luminosity. And you do that so that when you adjust your curve, it's going to affect only the luminosity, the tonal range of your image, and not affect the color. So now how do I want to move this curve? If I want more contrast, I want to go down at the bottom and up at the top. Anytime I have a steeper line between 2 points on the tonal scale, I have more contrast. I'm going to drag those points off of there and show you something else. If I simply move any point in the curve up, I get brighter. If I move any point on the curve down, I get darker. More contrast would be brighter at one part of this tonal scale up at the top and darker at another part of the tonal scale down at the bottom. But what if I want to know specifically a range of tones? Like what tones are in this grassy area? Well, there's a little icon, a little tool here in the properties of this curve adjustment. It's like a little finger pointing, sort of upside down little finger gun. And if I click on that, my cursor is now an eyedropper, and if I roll over my image, you will see on the curve, bouncing back and forth, a little dot, little circle telling me where these tones are. If I go to a dark part of this image, you'll see that curve, that little circle is down near the bottom of the curve. If I go to a brighter part of this grassy area, for instance, you'll see the line, that little dot on the upper part of the curve, or higher up. Now I can simply go to the curve and mark those 2 points, or roughly about where they are. And now if I drag one down and the other up, I get more contrast in that range of tones. But I'll show you that when you have this tool on, you can also simply grab, like go to that area and click on wherever that tone is, and it sets the point on the curve for you. I'm going to go to a darker area here and click and set a darker tone. Now I've got those 2 points. Now I can adjust them up and down if I want. Getting even more advanced, and here again I'm going to drag these points right off the curve to get rid of them. Even more advanced, if I have that finger pointy tool on, if I go and find a brighter part of the tonal range and I click and drag, I can drag upward or downward to change that point on the curve. So if I go to a lighter point and drag it upward a little bit, if I then go to a darker point and drag it downward a little bit, again I get an increase of contrast. And we can see before and after by turning on and off the preview. There's before, there's after, and I've got my increase in contrast. What if you wanted to have more contrast but also overall darker? Well, just take your 2 points, and you can actually shift click the second point so that they're both active at once. If you drag them both down, you've still maintained more contrast because it's steeper between those 2 points, but because they're both lower, you have added, or you have darker tones. If I drag both of those points up, now I have more contrast but lighter. And again, I'll turn that on and off so you can see the difference. I kind of like it with a little bit brighter and more contrast, so that's where I'm going to leave it. The last thing I'm going to do before I end this part of the video and go on to the next part is I'm going to go over to that curves layer and I'm going to double click on the name, and I'm going to rename that curves layer for what it does and where. So I'll say grass, more contrast, brighter. And that's great. So you'll remember what you've done, and I will be able to know what you've done when I look at your files. All right, I'm going to stop this one and we'll move on to part 2.